Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing the art of film, the history of cinema, and again, today we're going to be interchanging those terms, film and cinema, so don't be confused. But the history of cinema is to an extent dominated by technology. So when we're thinking about film, we're thinking about an art form that's relatively recent, right? The earliest films created in the early 20th century, so really only about 100 years old. The earliest films were in black and white. They were limited, pretty limited in terms of speed to 24 frames per second, and they didn't have any sound until 1926. And then another, few decades past that, color started to be introduced into films, and they were they were recorded on film. Now today it's digital, so just like a digital camera versus a film camera, same kind of thing. But we still use that term film to discuss the world of cinema. So that's kind of the term we're going to use here. Subject matter of film. Okay, so I want us to think about how often and how frequently and how perhaps surface level-y we enjoy films, right? Most of us have a Netflix account or access to one, or, we see films on TV, on HBO, on Hulu. There's no shortage of film availability to us today. But how often do we actually stop and analyze the films we're watching? Probably not frequently. So hopefully today will kind of help you open up your eyes a little bit to everything that goes into this art form, because it's pretty complex. Starting with its subject matter. The complexity of subject matter is really only rivaled by literature. And it can have multiple subject matters. So it could be about death and perseverance and, multiple things at once, because it is a long narrative, usually telling some kind of a story, which we'll discuss. Not all films tell stories, but many of them do. And except for opera, film probably requires the biggest collaborative effort of any art form. Now, earlier in the early days, directors did everything, but today we've got script writers, directors, which are also known as auteurs or authors, producers, camera operators, actors, props people, costume makers, set design, like people who do the casting, all of those kinds of elements. There's so many people that go into making a successful film. So it really is complex, both in subject matter and in the technical aspects as well. Okay, directing and editing. Directing and editing control the end look or the feel of a work, and that's really what crafts it into art. So let's take these piece by piece. When we're talking about, let's look at directing first. So when we're talking about directing, we're talking about the idea of controlling both acting and photography as of today. But back in the day when film first kind of started, early directors did everything. So a director would do the directing, they would do the editing, they would do the camera work, they would do the casting. Basically, they made the whole movie by themselves. But today, with the increase of budgets and the like, they can hire a lot of different people to do all those different aspects so that they can really make their aspect, their job great. So today, directors really just control the acting. They oversee the acting. They kind of tell actors, I'm looking for this from this scene, or give me more of that or less of this, and the photography. And then directors will choose from a variety of shots that were taken to achieve the end result they want. So the directors really have a lot of the creative control of telling the story. And when we're talking about a shot, we're talking about a continuous length of film without a break. And there's lots of different kinds of shots, and we're going to talk about those momentarily. The next thing we're going to look at is editing. I have my child here. Oh, geez. The next thing we're going to talk about is editing. Okay, the editing is the process by which footage is cut and then joined back together for the optimum creative effect. Okay, and really what's interesting is that editing is impossible in real life experience. And what I mean by that is we can't edit our own lives, right? We experience the good, We experience the bad, the mundane. We can't edit real life, but we can edit a film. So we can really make it extremely effective because we can cut out the parts that are not highlighting or are not maybe not relevant to whatever message we're trying to put out. So directors can really accent the important things by editing out the things that are unimportant. Okay, so let's talk about a variety of different shots that a director can use or work with to accomplish the end goal. Okay, so first we have the establishing shot. The establishing shot is usually a distant shot that establishes important locations or figures in the action. So establishing is kind of, it's usually one of the first shots we see in a film. A close-up would be hopefully, self-explanatory, but an important object, like the face of a character, is filling the screen. So we're real close up on that character's face. Here's an example of a close-up shot right there from Avatar. Okay, a long shot where the camera is far distant from the most important characters or scenes. So this is the opposite of a close-up. The medium shot, which is somewhere in between, where the camera focuses neither on the close nor the distant. There can be medium close-ups and medium long shots too, so kind of just a spectrum of how close you are to the subject of that shot. And then a following shot, which is where the camera keeps a moving figure in the frame, kind of keeping pace with the figure. So let me give you an example of a following shot right here.
If you accept the belief that the high Trendex automatically means a rising sales curve, which incidentally...
Mr. Donhill?
Good night, Eddie. Say hello to the missus.
We're not talking.
So you can see how the camera is following these figures, okay? This is a following shot. And it's moving, so did you see how the camera moved to the left, and it's going to continue moving to the left, following the characters in the shot. Okay. All right, so moving on. We've got the point of view shot, which is where the camera records what the character must be seeing. When the camera moves, it implies the character's gaze moves. So let's take an example of that. Okay, this is not it. Let me get rid of this. Okay, this is a point of view shot that I'd like you to take a look at. So as you see the camera panning up, we're meant to understand that this is the man's gaze. He started looking at the bouquet of flowers and then he moved up. Now he's looking at the woman, okay? So the shot is meant to suggest that this is his perspective. And this is probably something that we see quite frequently in horror movies or in like murder mysteries, where it's like the murderer is kind of creeping up on someone and you can kind of see that person's, they're looking through the bushes or whatever, and we're given to understand that that's the murderer's perspective, okay? So that's the point of view shot. A tracking shot is a shot in which the camera moves forward, backward, or sideways. So this is not to be confused with the following shot. The following shot is following the figures wherever they go, but the tracking shot is simply just moving forward or backward or sideways. So let me give you an example here. Okay, this is a tracking shot, moving backward. It's another tracking shot. This is one moving sideways. And this is a forward tracking shot. Okay. Next we have the crane shot, where a camera is on a crane or a movable platform and moves upward or downward, so we can get kind of like that bird's eye view. A handheld shot where the camera is carried, sometimes on a special harness by the camera operator. So we've all probably seen someone carrying, a camera maybe on their shoulder, and they're moving, or they're holding it kind of down below and they're moving it with the scene that's happening. Maybe a little bit more like, bouncy of a shot. Might not be as smooth, but we kind of get a more raw or organic feel from that. And then we have the recessional shot where the camera focuses on figures and objects moving away. And then a processional shot focuses on figures and objects moving toward the camera. Okay, so here's some examples of shots, and now let's talk about cuts. So the cuts really have more to do with the relationship between the shots. So kind of how are we transitioning from one shot to another? So first we have the continuity cut, and this follows the action stage by stage. A jump cut will jump, kind of like its name suggests, from one take to another, kind of abruptly and usually with no preparation. Sometimes it's sort of a shock or a revelation in the film. A cut in, which is an immediate move from a wide shot to a very close shot. And you can also have a cut out, which is the opposite, moving from very close to farther out. A cross cut, which is alternating shots of two or more distinct actions occurring in different places. So I'm going to show you an example in a moment, but you could think of like a telephone call, showing one person being on the call and then the other person on the call and then back to the first person on the call, but it's happening at the same time. A dissolve, where one scene disappears slowly while the next scene appears like as if it's beneath it. A fade, so you can have a fade in or a fade out, which happens frequently, in the beginning of a scene or a beginning of a film rather, where maybe it's dark and it sort of fades in, and then the end of a film it could fade out into darkness, so that's another transition. A wipe, which is a transition between shots with a line kind of moving through the screen to separate it. That's a little bit maybe more of an old school way, but we still see it on occasion. A graphic match, which is joining two shots with similar composition, color, or scene. A montage sequence, which is a sequence of images dramatically connected but physically disconnected. And a shot or a reverse shot, which is a pair of shots in which the first shot shows a character looking at something and a reverse shot shows what the character sees. So I know I just threw a lot of information at you right now. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. So here are some of those examples.
Films come in all different styles, formats, and lengths. One thing almost all of them have in common is that they use some editing. That is, ways of transitioning between scenes or shots. Some edits are very obvious, and some are not so obvious. Here are 13 editing types that you need to know. The standard cut is the most basic cut you can do. It connects two clips together, the end frame of one and the beginning frame of the next. A jump cut gets its name due to how it jumps the scene in time. It's usually done within the same frame or composition. A montage is an editing technique that can signify the passage of time, a flashback, or an artistic compilation of imagery, often underscored with music. Dissolving between the clips can signify a passage of time, or it can use the overlapping layers or dissolves to show multiple stories or scenes happening at once, but shot at different times. It's not typically used for normal edits, so use only when it's motivated. Wipe away one clip and reveal the next, usually with a digital transition. There are basic wipes like in Star Wars, diagonal, side to side, and there are more complex wipes and transitions. This is pretty straightforward. You fade out one clip and you fade in the other. This usually implies a passage of time, so don't use it for standard cuts, but it works well for night to day switch or someone falling asleep. J and L cuts get their names because of the way they're laid out on an editing timeline. An L cut is used when audio from clip A continues when clip B's video comes in. The J cut is the opposite. Audio from clip B comes in when we're still seeing clip A. Interviews are almost always edited with J and L cuts, for example. Cutting at the point of action is standard practice for editors, because that's what a viewer's eyes and brains are naturally expecting. Whenever the action is happening, we expect to see the edit take place to either draw us in or create another angle. Cutaways are typically insert shots that take viewers away from the main characters or action. They give extra context to the scene, can create more tension and foreshadowing, or give an interesting juxtaposition. Cutting between two different scenes that are happening at the same time in different places is when you want to use cross-cutting or parallel editing. It can add tension, excitement, or give a comparison between two characters' experiences. A match cut is an edit that gives a context and continuity to the scene and pushes it in a certain direction without disorienting the viewer, while keeping the composition, word, or the action matched between the two clips. The most famous examples are 2001: A Space Odyssey and Lawrence of Arabia, but it's still a very common technique. If you've got a loud scene that immediately goes to a quiet scene, or vice versa, this is where you'd use the smash cut. Use it when you're transitioning between two completely different scenes, emotions, or narratives, and you intend to make an abrupt transition. The goal of invisible cuts is to keep the shot looking like one continuous take or creatively move between the scenes. Birdman, Gravity, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and others have used these cuts incredibly well. Whip pans work to blur the edit, as does filling the screen with a solid color or foreground object to use at your edit point. Although these are listed as individual editing tips, you can combine them in any way that you want, as long as it makes sense. Try dissolving match cuts, smash cut to an L cut, cross cut between two montages, or more. The point is to learn these basic techniques first, and then you can start experimenting and get more creative. If you want to see more videos, go ahead and...
Okay, so there we have some examples of some of these cuts. You can kind of take a look at some of those at your leisure, especially as we're getting ready for our engagement for this week. Now, I want to think about form and film as well. So with all of the different aspects of the humanities we're looking at, we're considering what is the form and how does it tell us about content, right? So this is an example of, this is Citizen Kane. This is an example from your text. And this is Kane and his first wife near the end of their marriage. And this is a shot that kind of emphasizes the distance between them, both physically and emotionally. And we can kind of get that from looking at this shot. And your text says that placing the camera so far below the table produces this sort of unsettling moment in the film. And we also feel very far away from them as well. So this is an example of how the form of film can tell us about content. And so by contrast, we could look at the shot from Avatar that I used earlier, the close-up shot, where Sam Worthington's character falls in love with Zoe Saldana's character. So what does this close-up shot tell us about their closeness, right? So we could think about their facial expressions. We could think about their posture, their body language. So we've got sort of the man in this position of strength, kind of looking off into the distance, and we've got the more kind of tender, the woman kind of like leaning into him, looking at his face. So we kind of get more of a sense of closeness. And then if we contrast it with this shot, we have a sense of distance, isolation. And again, we're very far away from the characters as well, so we almost feel like we don't know them either. So if we think about form, we can think about what does that form mean, just like we would for a painting or a photograph, we can do for a film, okay? The participative experience and film. So we often lose ourselves in films, even the worst ones, and we're going to talk about that during our discussion. But we often can identify with characters who represent our values. So this is a way that we can participate. And your text uses the example of Forrest Gump, where Tom Hanks' character represents this innocence or this kindness. And we may or may not feel like we can relate to his life, but nearly all of us can see him as kind of like an ideal hero. You know, something, you know, that he's got aspects of kindness and innocence that we would like to see in ourselves, or innocence that maybe we had and have lost. So this is an example of a participative experience. And, you know, one thing to think about is, you know, why is this? Why do we lose ourselves in films? Why do we see ourselves in films maybe even more than we do in theater? What do you think the difference is? So I'd like for us to kind of be thinking about that as we're leading up to our discussion. The film image. Okay, the film most closely represents or resembles our lives, right? It's a series of moving images. And so, for that reason, experts argue that film is the most moving of arts, and you may disagree for different reasons. Um, but this here is an example of what we call film noir. Okay. Its hallmark features are strong light and dark shadows for dramatic effect. It's usually a dramatic film as well. And it usually involves crime or violence. Okay. This particular still was taken from The Lady from Shanghai in 1947. This is Rita Hayworth. Um, and your text states that film noir reflects social unrest and unease in the face of dramatic change, which probably makes sense considering this was filmed 2 years after the end of World War II, where everything was, still in a state of unrest and trying to figure out what does life look like after the war. But consider what's interesting here is we can consider the relationship between the form, right? We've got dramatic lighting, the very bright brights and the very dark darks, dramatic lighting, and then the content, which is also dramatic. This idea of social change and how dramatic that can be. So we've kind of got this crossover. So be thinking about how does the form inform the content. So we're going to continue to keep asking ourselves the same questions, okay? Camera point of view. Okay, how is the feeling of motion achieved in film? Well, it's done in a number of ways, usually between either the actors or the camera. So either the actors are moving, so either they're coming toward the camera, away from the camera, across the camera, or have you ever seen a movie where a train is sort of rushing towards you and then all of a sudden it kind of goes over your head? It's almost like you sort of fell down on the tracks and the train went over the top of you. So we get a sense of motion there. The camera moving. So in action scenes, the camera has to track with the action, like a chase scene. Or the camera lens can give us a feeling of motion if we go from wide to close up. We zoom in, we feel like we're kind of walking toward or away. Or we go from slow motion and fast motion, which can either arrest or divert our attention. So there's a number of ways we can get that sense of motion from film. And then lastly, sound. And again, sound was not introduced into film until 1927 in Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. And with the introduction of sound, we got not only music but also dialogue. Okay. And there's certain kinds of feelings that a film can achieve with music. So if you've ever watched like a scary movie and turned the sound off, it's not as scary anymore, is it? That's because music achieves so much in terms of feeling. It can do a lot of different things. It can prepare us for something that's about to happen, some kind of action or some kind of there's a monster lurking around the corner kind of thing. So we can get feelings of suspense or surprise, or a fast-paced chase scene might have some very charged music, or perhaps something that's more relaxed is going to have kind of a sweet, more lullaby kind of music, or something that's kind of lulling you. So music brings a lot to film. And it can also enhance our understanding of geographic location or culture. And so I want you to be thinking about what music and sound bring to film, especially as you're thinking about your engagements. Make sure that you're engaging with form, and I want you to be thinking about sound as well. What does the music add to it? That if it weren't there, what would that take away? And so that's going to include our overview of cinema today. Again, this is probably one of the most complex, engaging, and popular of the modern arts, and we're going to look at some interesting issues around it and discuss.